Everybody ready? So let's talk about Solomon. Solomon's he's a little bit of a difficulty. There's, because of his half heart, we are going to see hints from the author. Things are starting to show up in Solomon's reign and rule that maybe they're red flags. We'll start to see in some of the details. In chapter 3, we have a prime example here in some of the details. And when you read about Solomon, sometimes these hints are somewhat subtle, coming from the author. But right away we see something that might be a red flag. Then Solomon formed a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord, the wall around Jerusalem. The people were still sacrificing on the high places. Remember, the high places are outside of the prescribed areas out there, and probably are remnants or leftovers from the pagan worship that would be going on. Because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. Now Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except, it's one of those big buts of the Bible right there, he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. You see the conundrum that we have for King Solomon. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Which part of the heart is going to show up? And the king went to Gibeon. And remember, Gibeon is that tall place, to sacrifice there. For that was the great high place, because it was tall. That's what the name means. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. Is this good? A tall sacrifice in a tall place. Is that kind of what the author is screaming off the page here? In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night. And God said, "Ask what you wish me to give you." So we have this exchange now, this divine exchange between Solomon and the Lord. But it seems interesting in the context of what we just saw with Solomon. This is the nature of course you know, the request for what Solomon asked for. And he's asking for wisdom from the Lord as a gift out of this heart. This heart that's somewhat divided already, I think we can make the case for. Let's look at the details. But before we move on, one of the things that I also want to throw in here is the reference to the wall around Jerusalem, chapter 3, verse 1. Of course, the wall there is going to be reinforced. This is the Solomonic wall around Jerusalem, and we have archaeological evidence of it in place there. But to reinforce the city walls is interesting as it reveals, who's really in charge of winning this battle. It gets back to, why did David take the census near at the end of his life? Are these kings struggling with the Lord being king, the Lord being the victorious one on the battlefield? Unlike David and his victory over the giant Goliath, sometimes, you get a little too big for your own britches, as my mom used to say, that kind of a thing. But here we certainly have the emphasis of King Solomon, and he's wanting to sacrifice at these high places. I don't think this is good. This is not authorized, authentic worship of the one true God. This is maybe syncretism starting to creep in. Yahweh, of course, but now we're starting to see this bringing in of other pagan-type practices. It comes at, it kind of reminds us of the request for king that goes all the way back to 1 Samuel 8. Remember, the king is requested so that we can be like the nations around us. Saul, that was the first king. So it's kind of like we have a little bit of Saul now creeping into the mix as well. Where is Solomon's heart? 100%? Is it 50%? Is it 80-20? What have we got going on here? But let's look at the rest of the text here. This is a pivotal chapter. And you see in verse 6, Solomon prays his prayer, "Thou hast shown great covenant loyalty, loving kindness to your servant David my father, according as he walked before thee in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart toward thee, and thou hast reserved for him this great loving kindness, that thou hast given him a son to sit on his throne as it is to this day. And now, O Lord my God, you've made thy servant king in place of my father David, yet I am but a little child. I do not know how to come in or go out, and thy servant is in the midst of thy people, which thou hast chosen, a great people who cannot be numbered or counted for multitude. So give thy servant wisdom and understanding heart to judge thy people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of thine? And verse 10, it was pleasing in the sight of the Lord that Solomon asked for this thing, and God said, because you've asked for this thing and have not asked for yourself long life, nor asked for riches for yourself, you've asked for the life of your enemies, but you've asked for yourself discernment or wisdom to understand justice. Behold, I've done according to your words. Behold, I've given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. Now I've given you what you ask. And I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you for all your days. But if you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and commandments as your father David walked, then I'll prolong your days. What's interesting is you have woven through here, sometimes we see, well, Solomon asked for wisdom, so he's kind of off the hook. But no, the charge is, with the wisdom that comes to you as a gift, there's still the expectation for Solomon to have the heart with feet and to walk and to demonstrate fidelity and covenant fidelity and walking in the commandments just as David walked. So there's still this expectation of follow-through. The question will be this: how well will Solomon use his gift of wisdom in this covenant context? Will he be using his gift of wisdom more like say a pagan king would? Or will he use his heart of wisdom like a true Israelite, Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 20 king should? That's the question. That's the way forward here as we move ahead. So we'll be following that pretty carefully.
Just a quick question about Solomon's age. I mean, he said he was a child. Is there any historical?
He's just referring to himself in terms of
just his.
It's a humble gesture from the king.
He's not like.
He's getting started. He's
he's not like.
He's just a little naive, but
he's not.
I need a little help here, Lord. Yeah, it's like when I got my start in youth ministry.
Yeah.
Like, can I really do this, Lord?
Yeah.
Probably. I'm going to need your help on this. Yeah. Question.
For this glorious and beautiful temple.
What now?
Before this temple was built.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
Where was the authorized place to stack your stone and kill your animals?
Tabernacle.
That's still there.
Yeah, it's not going to. It's going to be taken over by the temple that's going to be built just around the corner here. So, yeah. All right. So I think we covered everything that we wanted to here. So his wisdom, after he receives this wisdom, we see beginning in verses 16 all the way down through 28, examples of Solomon applying the wisdom in good, righteous ways. In terms of judging, he's chapter 4. We see him verses 1 through 19, appointing officials to assist him and help in the leadership of the kingdom. We see details in verses 20 through 34 with regards to peace and prosperity in the land. So far, so good. All of these things. It seems the author is being kind of emphatic with regards to Solomon applying wisdom for the benefit of the kingdom. Let's look at just a couple of the verses as examples here in verse 20. Beginning in verse 20, you see a lot of a lot of emphasis coming in. Chapter 4, verse 20. Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. They were eating and drinking, rejoicing. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the river, Tigris Euphrates, to the land of the Philistines, furthest west, furthest east, and furthest north, furthest south. Israel's provision for one day was, you see all those details there given. There's just kind of the author is really being emphatic. Interestingly, here's how some of his wisdom is being applied in chapter 4. Let's look at verse 32. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon, even to the hyssop that grows on the wall. He became an expert in all things related to identifying nature around him. He became the first, expert in animal study and botany and all that. I don't know. He's just wise. He's just the author gives us all kinds of things here. So this is the extent of his rule. We saw that in verse 24. He had the dominion over everything. Yeah, we saw that from the... So he grew and expanded the kingdom for the benefit of, and it seems as if that's what should have happened. I don't think we can argue that if we go all the way back to Genesis 15, you see some of the echo, the idea of the more numerous than the stars. You remember that this was the promised land. This was what was God's promise to the patriarch Abraham. And in Genesis 15, we saw, if I can get there, verses 1 through 5. When Abraham's doubting, he takes him outside in verse 5, look toward the heavens and count the stars. If you're able to count them, he said, so shall your descendants be. In this promised land where you're going to go and express yourself as a nation, this is all that's coming. And now we see the fulfillment now as an extension of Solomon's application of this God-given gift for the purpose and benefit of the kingdom along the lines of the divine agenda. So I don't think we're outside of anything yet as we do an analysis of Solomon. In verse 26, we see Solomon's stables, 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. And in verses 27 through 28, those deputies provided for King Solomon and all who came to King Solomon's table. Each in this month they left nothing lacking. They also brought, this is I think part of the taxation, the barley, straw for the horses, and swift steeds to the place where it should be, each according to his charge. Now God gave Solomon wisdom and very great discernment and breadth of mind like the sand that is on the seashore. And Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the sons of the east and all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than all men. He spoke, so we've got this exaggeration. So we're, and it's from here, from this high point, you might argue for, that the building or the construction on the temple begins. Solomon is going to apply his wisdom, and you see beginning in chapter 5 here, we're going to see him going out and bringing in the best of the best with regards to the construction workers, the planners, the builders, and all of that as he starts to rev up for the building of the temple. And we see the construction begins. In a lot of the details, as I said before, when we looked back in Exodus 36 through 40, a lot of time and energy is spent giving the details of this, the earthly representation, I think, of an eternal reality. And here we have it in a similar amount of chapters in 1 Kings. Chapters 5 through 8 give us all of the details with regards to the building of the temple. 1 Kings chapter 6. Let's look at a little bit here in verse 11 through 14.
Before we go there, may I ask you a question? Chapter 4, we see that Solomon has the 40,000 scout horse and the 12,000 horsemen. And last time we saw in Deuteronomy chapter 14 that he should not multiply horses. It is 17, 14.
Mm-hmm.
How do we see this together?
I see it as the beginning of Solomon probably acting outside of the description of the kind of king should be in Israel. You're right. I failed to mention it, but I have it in my cheat sheet here. The reference to that and the details in building, that's amassing an army. You see, you're right. Is Solomon amassing that army out of his gift of wisdom, exercising his whole heart? Or is this Solomon exercising his gift of wisdom, amassing an army as a pagan king would? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. We don't really know quite yet. I mean, if you want to jump right in and be critical of Solomon, the answer, who wins the battles? Solomon. You're taxing your people for the purpose of building a kingdom. You're charging admission to, well, we're going to see that soon here, for people coming in to be exposed to this gift. And you know, he's amassing wealth. You know, he's entering into, we saw from the very beginning in chapter 4, the alliance with King of Pharaoh, taking Pharaoh's daughter, right? Chapter 4, verse 1. So he's entering into covenant deals with pagan kings in the exchange of women that goes on. You see that there. So you can start to see some fractures in Solomon, I'd say. You're right. In all three areas. Amassing gold, amassing an army, and entering into unnecessary treaties, the amassing of women. And what's he doing with regards to reading the Torah, copying it, and living it out in front of his people? So maybe that's the good thing about Proverbs that he's amassing in verse 32. As we'll see, I'll make the case that, like Psalms for David, the ones that David was responsible for, the wholehearted king shows up. David's writing songs and psalms for the faithful remnant who are singing theology as an overflow of a wholehearted king. Solomon will do the same with regards to the writing and the collection of wisdom sayings as I'll call it an application book of the covenant, of the Torah. How do you apply it and all the details of life? That'll be Proverbs, and wisdom will come into play there. So Solomon's wisdom, I think, will come in to that. And also the writing of the books of Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. Those are also the contributions of Solomon's whole heart, or at least the part of his heart that was not given over to doing it like a pagan king. So, did you have a question? Okay, all right, well, good question. So we talked about the tabernacle. Let's see, verses, chapter 6. We were in chapter 6. I was going to look at verses 11 through 14. So we're right in the midst of building the temple, chapter 6, verse 11. Now the word of the Lord came to Solomon, saying, concerning this house which you are building, if you walk in my statutes and execute my ordinances and keep all my commandments by walking in them, then I will carry out my word with you, which I spoke to David your father, and I will dwell among the sons of Israel, and will not forsake my people Israel. In other words, Solomon, don't think that by building this temple in my name, that it is a rabbit's foot of success for you and your kingdom. You're building this temple for me, but don't think that you're able to control and manipulate me, that is God, through the building of this temple. This is and we've seen this before, where the tabernacle's brought here and it's brought here, and it's just going to bring us good luck on the battlefield. And the Philistines, hey, this will bring us, an extra, bumper crop in the spring when we harvest our crops. I mean, look at what it was doing for Israel. Now we've got it, ha ha ha. No, I mean, we got to watch, and I think this might be that the question that we ask ourselves with this little short exchange here in verses 11 through 14 was what is the Lord calling Solomon on the carpet about? Is he starting to see the fractures? Is the Lord stepping in and say, Lord, or Solomon, you've got, don't you get off track here. You've got this wisdom, you're doing great, but remember, it's about obedience. It's about a whole heart with feet, and all that we've talked about. So it's a fair question that we have. So is this the heart reflective of syncretism? So the Lord is dwelling amongst his people where he's enthroned. How's that? The Lord dwells with his people when he is the king over his people. Contrary to the book of Judges and what the author there reminds us of, there was no king in Israel, and if my thesis is correct, it was a statement of a time period when the people of the Lord, God's people, by their activity and actions, dethrone him. But the enthronement of God is not because there's a temple in the land, it's because the people are walking in obedience, and then he's enthroned, and that's where he resides. So something like that, I think, might be going on here, but I wouldn't break a church up over it. So I think we have a little bit of that. And, you know, what Moses talked about in Deuteronomy chapter 8, remember in verses, it's beginning in verse 11 and 18 through 20, you can forget God, Moses warns, when you get to the land. Don't do it. Don't forget the Lord by A, B, and C. And we talked about that. And here we have Solomon. Is it even possible to forget the Lord in the midst of this temple building? Does the temple itself become a distraction or something like that? So, all right, well, let's just move ahead here. But it seems, though, Solomon is on a roll, and we're going to see that here with his prayer of dedication. It's just around the corner here. The Ark of the Covenant is brought into the temple. Solomon applies his great wisdom. He applies the details of how to correctly carry it and transport it. No one gets hurt. We see that in chapter 8, verses 6 through 8. The priests brought the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord to its place into the inner sanctuary of the house, to the most holy place under the wings of the cherubim. For the cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark, and the cherubim made a covering over the ark and its poles from above. But the poles were so long, got to have those long poles, that the ends of the poles could be seen from the holy place before the inner sanctuary, but they could not be seen outside. They are there to this day. All right, so that's what we have. The Ark of the Covenant's brought home in chapter 8. And before addressing the Lord in corporate prayer, Solomon addresses and blesses the people. And we see that address begin in chapter 8, verse 12. Let's see here. Could I have Jared Jackson? Are you here? Yeah. Could I have you read beginning in chapter 8, verse 12, down through verse 14?
Then Solomon said, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in thick darkness. I have indeed built you an exalted house, a place for you to dwell in forever." Then the king turned around and blessed all the assembly of Israel, while all the assembly of Israel stood.
Okay, so this is a public event. Would have had a huge impact, a much needed impact, with regards to, now we're coming out full tilt out of this 400-year period of chaos. We're no longer in a day now where everyone's doing what is right in their own eyes. Now we've got king is doing whatever is right in the eyes of the Lord. So Solomon's future role, like David, in his theologically I talked about this before. David, the songwriter; Solomon, the wisdom saying collector and author. So the book of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, all of these things are going to be the product of at least the part of Solomon's heart that's going to come forth in the right way as a means of being in line with the divine agenda and benefit the kingdom. So let's take a look now at the Solomon's prayer, and we have this really a high point of Solomon's speaking ministry to his people. This is the focus that Solomon gives. Verses 22 through 24, we see that the Lord is the one who's in focus, the Lord who keeps his covenant. And you see that in verse 22 through 24. Let's see, let's have Jenny, could you read for us in chapter 8, verses 22 through 24.
Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly of Israel, spread out his hands towards heaven, and said, "Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below. You who keep your covenant of love with your servants, who continue wholeheartedly in your way. You have kept your promise to your servant David, my father. With your mouth you have promised, and with your hand you have fulfilled it as it is today.
So the Lord who keeps his covenant, Solomon's going to talk about the temple being the earthly representation of the eternal reality, I'd argue. It's the place where real exchange over sin takes place. It's the place where people are coming and putting feet to the teachings of Moses with regards to the sacrificial system. Remember the book of Leviticus. Now we've got this permanent place, and by the way, it's where the name and the reputation of the Lord is to be demonstrated, but also through the sacrifices of the faithful. Sin needed to be dealt with, and we see in verses 30, let's look at verses 33 through 36. We see a little bit of focus on this. When thy people Israel are defeated before an enemy because they have sinned against thee, if they turn to thee again and confess thy name and pray and make supplication to thee in this house, then hear thou in heaven and forgive the sin of thy people Israel and bring them back to the land which thou didst give to their fathers. So you see this focus on sin. When the heavens are shut up and there's no rain, verse 35, because they have sinned against thee, and they pray toward this place and confess thy name and turn from their sin, that's repentance, when thou dost afflict them, then hear thou in heaven and forgive the sin of thy servants and of thy people Israel. Indeed, teach them the good way in which they should walk. Send rain on thy land, so that's the blessing that comes, which thou hast given thy people for an inheritance. So that's the exchange there. Solomon is being a good Deuteronomy 17 king, reminding the people of what Moses taught. We have to be a nation who deals with sin corporately and individually. The temple's to be a showcase for the watching world, verse 41 through 43. Notice this, Solomon prays, also concerning the foreigner who is not of thy people Israel, when he comes from a far country for thy name's sake, for they will hear of thy great name and thy mighty hand and of thine outstretched arm. When he comes and prays toward this house, hear thou in heaven thy dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to thee. So now we finally see the beginnings of how blessing is to be extended to the nations, right? In order that all the peoples of the earth may know thy name, thy reputation, to fear thee, as do thy people Israel, and that they may know that this house which I have built is called by thy name. Not bad. That lines up pretty well. That's the showcase for the world, the center of God's holiness, his presence among his people, as his people live out holiness and the holy implications of a life built on faithfulness and fidelity. Everyone around is supposed to be seeing that and say, what is going on there? I need to find out what's going on in that place. And however they hear about it, there's going to be a global impact as a result. And Solomon gets that. And he sees this temple as you might say, it's a centerpiece of the missional effort of the church of that day. Well, we're not done yet. Verses 46 through 53. Even the theology of exile and return are laid out here. Let's have Mark Lindgren. Could you read for us in verse 46 through 53?
Okay. If they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you are angry with them and give them to an enemy, so that they are carried away captive to the land of the enemy, far off or near, yet if they turn their heart in the land to which they have been carried captive, and repent and plead with you in the land of their captors, saying, we have sinned and have acted perversely and wickedly. If they repent with all their mind and with all their heart in the land of their enemies, who carried them captive, and pray to you toward their land, which you gave to their fathers, the city that you have chosen, and the house that I have built for your name, then hear in heaven your dwelling place, their prayer and their plea, and maintain their cause, and forgive your people who have sinned against you, and all their transgressions that they have committed against you, and grant them compassion in the sight of those who carried them captive, that they may have compassion on them. For they are your people and your heritage, which you brought out of Egypt, from the midst of the iron furnace. Let your eyes be open to the plea of your servant and to the plea of your people Israel, giving ear to them whenever they call to you. For you separated them from among all the peoples of the earth as your heritage, as you declared through Moses your servant, when you brought our fathers out of Egypt, O Lord.
Well, that's good. We have a little background music to bring emphasis to the fact that here we have a reference to the special inheritance. Do you see that in verse 51? That reminds us of Exodus 19. You remember the Segulah discussion that we had last fall? The special treasure idea that comes out of Exodus 19, verse, I think it's 4 or 5 there, where the Lord calls his people, Israel, by that designation, you are my Segulah, my special treasure. Out of all of the most prized possessions, out of the warehouse of valuable things, to the King of Kings, whose or what is the most prized of all? You know, it's Israel. That's what he says in Exodus 19. So we see here the fierce loyalty of God as king when even his own people would be exiled. There's a sense that through repentance, through the repentance of his people, the Lord is covenantally obligated to go find them and bring them back. And that's the promise that we have built into Solomon's prayer of dedication here. And then we have the benediction here in verses 56 through 61. And with this, it focuses on God as king, the reality, the eternal reality of God as king, and the one Lord, the one king, and the one heart idea from the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4. Because one king calls for one heart, the singularity of heart. And we see that in the close of Solomon's benediction here. So to close this event, we have one more reprimand that we have in chapter 9. Let's just look at verses 1 through 9 and we'll finish for the morning. So this is a high point. And we've got sacrifice and all the right things and theological foundations and truths are being shared and unpacked in this prayer and this benediction. And then we have chapter 9, verses 1 through 9. Now it came about when Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house and all that Solomon desired to do, that the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, and he appeared to him at Gibeon. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your supplication, which you have made before me. I have consecrated this house which you have built by putting my name there forever. And my eyes and my heart will be there perpetually. And as for you, if you walk before me as your father David walked, in integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I've commanded you, and I will keep my statutes and my ordinances, then I'll establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever, just as I promised to your father David, saying, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. But if you or your son shall indeed turn away from following me, shall not keep my commandments, my statutes, which I've set before you, and shall go and serve other gods and worship them, then I'll cut off Israel from the land which I have given them, and the house which I have consecrated for my name. I will cast out of my sight. So Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all the peoples. And this house will become a heap of ruins. Everyone who passes by will be astonished and hiss and say, why has the Lord done thus to this land and to this house? So it's not about the physical structure. It's about the heart of the people. So there's this reminder that Solomon is to be the kind of king in Israel who's leading the spiritual heart connection of his nation, individuals, and as a corporate group. It's about the heart. So the king is, even Solomon is being charged with that task of keeping the focus where it needs to be. The temple could be a distraction, and it could just as easily be built or torn down. But it's all about the heart condition of this nation, my prized possession, Segulah, Israel. So we'll see when we come back next week what happens with King Solomon. So Thanks for your attention today, and have a good week.